Hey, what's up? Silas here. I think problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So this is part of my Perception Matters series, where I just kind of go over things where I think the perception that people have of certain things creates problems that I don't think actually exist when you actually look at it from a different point of view. And sometimes from not seeing it from the point of view of the person, you might not understand the issue that they have, but if you can, you might be able to kind of get what they're getting at. Now, with this sort of perception and perspective and things like this, there is something recently that Peter Dinklage, who is an actor in Hollywood in the United States of America, y'all might know him from Game of Thrones. He's been in other things as well. I'm pretty sure he was in Nip Tuck back in the day. He's been in like Elf, where he actually there was a scene where they're playing on it where like the Will Ferrell's character thought Buddy the Elf. Will Ferrell's character is Buddy the Elf. He was actually a normal sized human, saying normal sized human, average sized human who's raised in the North Pole, and there's a scene where he like confuses Peter Dinklage's character, who's like the CEO of the company that he's working at, being an elf, and he runs across the table. So there's things like that. He's used his height and things like that as an actual part of who he plays. In Game of Thrones, he played Tyrion Lannister, who was an actual character that had a condition in that world, and that's part of why he got the position. I don't think they're specific on what condition the character of Tyrion had within that universe, but Dinklage himself was born with achondroplasia, which is a form of short-limbed dwarfism, and he's the only member in his family with that condition. And there's different forms of these conditions that afflict different humans or different humans have. Some makes the limbs shorter, some makes the whole body themselves like shorter. Like with the limbs shorter, you'll have probably a average sized torso for a male or female of your age, but then you'll have shorter limbs. So there's different issues with that. He had something to say, and then that led to me thinking about this, and now just getting into the things that I wanted to say. Some of you may have noticed the calls for more and supposedly fair and accurate representation in the retelling of older stories. People might say, we need representation of X because we need to be seen, or we need Y to write about Y because only Y can have the lived experience to write about Y, or we need Z parts to be played by Z because only Z can depict Z. This is an increasingly common sentiment in the entertainment industry in the USA and different parts of the West. It has grown from not simple representation, but how the representation is done. Ostensibly, it's a call for more females, who are a majority of the United States and world population. It's like 51 to 52% in some places. It's a lot higher due to some things that were happening in the past. And various minorities who, in some cases, like Asians and Negroes, or Asiatic Oriental people and the Negroes, are a significant majority of the world population. But as I mentioned, this is focused on the United States of America and the West, where within those smaller areas, the 9% predominantly white areas of the world, have smaller minority groups living within those groups. So those people are the ones who are calling for some of these representation and supposed supporters and allies and things like this. So I care little about recasting things. I get that some people want their local entertainment to be in a way that they claim speaks to them, rather than, for example, being relatively middle class, well off black person that's gone to a good school, has a decent job, and then you don't see yourself on TV. Instead of going and finding movies and shows from Niger, which is like the Hollywood version in Nigeria, you might want somebody to be cast in a famous popular show that other people in your friend circle at your workplace are watching. So you're like, oh yeah, you feel like there's somebody in there that kind of speaks to you. I get that happens. I get that if you're born and raised in somewhere like Portland, as a fourth generation American, and that 4 generations ago your ancestors had somehow migrated in from China, and maybe you've just kept marrying other people of Chinese background while living in there. So you're still as Chinese genetically as somebody who's lived in China for their whole life, who's just been there for those 4 generations. But culturally, you're not necessarily that Chinese. So you won't necessarily just go to the China Hollywood version or go to like the Hong Kong stuff or the stuff in Japan, that stuff doesn't necessarily speak too much to you. So you might want an actual character that's brought into something localized. Oh, this is like Hawkeye or something. Oh, there's an Asian character and that speaks out to me. I get that might happen if that's kind of your reality. It's not my reality, but I think I can kind of see why for some people that might be appealing. So recast away. I know for me, I've even before I switched to reading audiobooks and listening to audiobooks, which is now my primary source of entertainment, I used to read books like other people do. Maybe some people just don't read books that much anymore. Like some audiobooks have the full cast playing it. So let's say there's maybe 4 or 5 main characters, they'll have different people doing the different voices in that. But most audiobooks is just one person reading it, which is similar to when you're reading the book for yourself. When you're reading that book for yourself, you realize the different characters in your mind. Sometimes some people might read them out loud. Oh, do you read out loud when you're reading books? I don't really recall myself doing that. Maybe there's certain scenes I would do it kind of just to get the feel of it. But in your mind, there's voices going on, and in your mind, sometimes those voices might change a bit. But regardless, the different sexes, the clines, the ages, even entirely alien species, they'll be in your mind. They'll be in your voice in a certain way. I just finished a really good audiobook. It was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and he's the one who wrote The Martian. It was narrated by Ray Porter, but there's something, I don't want to give any spoiler material, but there's something really cool they do with the audiobook that I'm wondering, how was that done in the book? Well, anyway, so there's different ways you can do things, there's different things that can be added, but I am not against that because I've done entire casts in my mind. So that's something that I think I could do. But I admit that my imagination is better than the average person's. I don't want to just project the level of imagination of people. Some people truly can't imagine something unless they see or hear it. And that's tough. There's many things in other fields where I can't really imagine doing that unless I see it or hear it. And even some things when I see or hear it, I still can't imagine doing those things. So I understand we have different limitations in different places. But I also don't read a book like Carmilla and think like, oh, this would speak more to me if I was an 18-year-old Austrian girl living in the late 1800s. Like, between equally talented male and female readers of this book, if they're doing an audiobook, could the 26-year-old woman with a slight European accent bring more to the audiobook than an 80-year-old Asian man? Yeah, a good chance that they could. But these are the considerations that people make when you're depicting something. Another good example of this specific thing, specifically when it's coming with age, were the audiobooks for the Song of Ice and Fire series. That's the George R.R. Martin one, which famously started the Game of Thrones series. In 2004, Roy Dotrice was 81, and he still had an admirable range to his voice, and he characterized the different leads in that book. By Feast of Crows, he was in his 90s, and it was a challenge getting past the characters sounding like old, crotchety men and crones. Like, you had, like, Daenerys was supposed to be this younger, vibrant, kind of, she sounded like an old crone, sounded like an old witch. Unfortunately, that's the thing, but also, unfortunately, Roy Dotrice has left us, so I don't know who is going to be reading this next part. So that's an extra challenge that you have to have. Roy Dotrice, very well respected, very well capable in it, but some things of just age or certain limitations that he was having. So the people out at Random House Audio chose to take this challenge on, and maybe it was a contractual one. And that's just some of the things that you have to consider. Now, you can go further and intentionally have all the male characters read or played by females and all the female characters read and played by males. You can decide to do that without changing anything in it. This again would raise the challenge to make certain stories credible, but that's on the people producing the show. That's on the people who are deciding to, I want this, I want other people to listen to this, I want other people to watch this, I want other people to, I guess with read it is different because like if you just have it in your mind, you can change these things around. But these are things that you decide to do. If they fail by trying to do X when the initial story was Y, then have at it. That's a risk you take, that's a loss you might actually incur by making that decision. So getting back to the main thing that inspired this, and this is what's Peter Dinklage had to say. You've probably found stories, you've probably heard about this before, but there'll be links somewhere. You can find the whole thing in him talking about it. But this is a quote about what Dinklage said when discussing the recent decision of Disney to do a live-action remake retelling of the Snow White story with the brave and stunning casting of, I am being told, this is the non-white Rachel Ann Zegler as the Snow White character. You can see an image of her on the screen if you're watching a video version of this. Okay, so this is what they said. Literally no offense to anyone, he said, but I was a little taken aback when they were very proud to cast a Latina actress as Snow White. You still telling the story of Snow White and the seven dwarfs? Take a step back and look at what you're doing here there. It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, and you're still making that effing backward story about seven dwarfs living in a cave together? What the F are you doing, man? So when I first heard this, I was thinking they should just get those men from the 2010 Chilean mine accident to play the dwarves. And there's a difference there. He says dwarfs. Like I don't know if this is like an American thing or like an English versus American English things. He says dwarfs with a DWARFS. I only think dwarves like DWARVES. So you should get them to play the dwarves. And some of those people are rather little. There's shorter people. There's smaller people. I remember going to a wedding down in Guatemala, and the people. This might be insulting. Might get me canceled. It just felt like I was kind of like a Rottweiler walking around different trials. Like they're smaller people. These are smaller people. Like it's just it's a thing. It's a thing. The thing is a thing. Like it just happens. They could do that. They could cut back on the CGI and commit to the bit. Change the location, all the other characters, and yeah, that could fit if you do this kind of changing on the things. Because otherwise, why is it progressive to just plump this person in there? And if you just pluck this person in there, I looked at the background of Rachel Zegler a bit. From the picture, you can see she's Snow White appearance-ish, kind of this Betty Boop type of look that she has. She has the brunette hair, the black hair, whatever you want to say it. I think her father is of Polish descent, and her maternal grandmother is of a Colombian descent. Now, if her maternal grandmother is of Colombian descent, then the daughter in that descent, and her mother would also have been like of Colombian descent. And then I don't know who the maternal grandfather was, but remember, this is the United States of America. This is the regressive type of stuff that they have. One drop rule is still very, very real. You can be a white woman and have a kid from every single other race, but as a white man, if you have a kid with somebody from any other race or clime, your kid is that person's race or clime. You can't have that. It's a reality that people have. Some people like believing that way, but that is what it is for the time being. Okay, so Ziegler seems to be, or Zegler, like Ziegler, like Ziegler, Zyle Ziegler. Zegler seems to already have that name. But what does a Latin name sound like? And we'll get to that soon. But she's had a background. She seems to be relatively talented. She just came from doing now a retelling of the West Side Story. She's 20. She's young. She's youthful. I think she'll fit the part pretty well. While she was in Catholic school, she was part of her stage play. I'm forgetting the name of the people who put on plays. Anyway, she was Ariel in The Little Mermaid. She was Dorothy Beck in 42nd Street. She was Belle in Beauty and the Beast. Princess Fiona in the Shrek the Musical. So these are stage plays she put on at school, and then she's done other things performances after that. So yeah, she's actually somebody who's relatively talented. I don't know, are they going to make this a musical? I don't know, they don't have to make it a musical, but I think she's going to be decent at the part. I don't think her being Latina is really too big of a deal, but for some people, oh yeah, it's progressive, I consider it kind of regressive. But will they change this and then like because she's Latina, it's such a big thing? Or will they call it Snow Latinx? It's like, yeah, that call them white. I never call them white, that triggers people. Let's do it Snow Latinx. I don't think they'll go that far because for some people, I think the primary thing is like, look, it's a white person, but we've changed that to somebody else. This is a key part of what it is for some people. I'm not saying it's a lot. I'm not saying it's a majority. Probably a fraction of the people. But for some people, that is the point. Like, yes, we scored something here. So, if Snow White's race can be changed, are the dwarves somehow core to the story? Now, mind you, when I hear dwarves, I think of these as an entirely separate species of their own. I don't think like, oh, these are Homo sapiens who have a condition or form of dwarfism called achondroplasia, like Peter Dinklage has. And when I think about this, if they actually are, would people think this is like an erasure of little people? And this is one of the things. Again, this is a perception that I have that some people might not share. I somehow think the term little people seems more offensive than midget. And when I hear midget, that's when I think, midget or little people, I think, okay, this is somebody with a condition. I think this is supposedly a human being with this condition. But dwarves, I see them as an entirely different species that are in fantasy. I don't know if that fits for me too. I never really thought of Peter Dinklage as a dwarf. I don't know. Maybe you did, but I just haven't really thought of it that way. So when I hear Dinklage taking umbrage with this particular thing, I'm thinking it's kind of like if Shaq was all of a sudden like, oh, it's an issue that you have giants in shows being these ornery kind of dumb beasts and brutes. I'm like, well, you're not a giant. You're a giant human being. You're a human being that's huge. But when I think giant, I don't think it's actually giants on Earth. It's a weird thing for me to think the person is taking actual issues with that in that sense. Especially when you have things like in current timeline where you just had the whole thing with the hobbits and the dwarves in the Lord of the Rings, and that was just shorter people mostly played those parts, but they used different kind of computer graphics and camera tricks to make the people look like they were much shorter. But Elijah Wood's not a hobbit. He's not somebody with a height condition. The person who played Gimli, I checked. John Rhys David. He supposedly was 6 foot tall, and then now he's getting older, so he's gotten a bit shorter, not to like 5'9" average height. I don't know if that's. I know you shrink a bit, your spine and things like that changes, compact and things like this as age happens. But at the very least, he was average height for the West, while he played this part of a dwarf. It's an entirely separate species. So that's how I think about dwarves. I don't really think that, oh, if you do this, it's affecting the people, the human beings, Homo sapiens with this condition. If you remove their characters, like now Disney is contemplating actually just taking these characters out, then is that an erasure? Would let people think, oh, you're erasing us, you're taking jobs away. Did now Peter Dinklage talking about this take jobs away from them? But we don't even know if in particular they were going to cast human beings with different conditions to play these parts, or if they'd go somewhere like the Lord of the Rings, and even the prequel with the prequel of The Hobbit. I think with that one, all those people who played those positions were just average human beings, average height human beings, or even taller ones. Like, and you can even do a like entire change, or you can have a thing like with Wolverine, which is played by Hugh Jackman. Wolverine, I think, in the comic books, is normally written as a character that's something like 5'2". He's a really short guy, but then Hugh Jackman was like 6'2", and to begin with, people were like, okay, this is going to be weird. But Hugh Jackman really pulled it off, really changed the character. Then now even in other comic book retellings, they have him as a taller character, and I think that was something to do with the comic book. So there's like something that happened, I think, post Age of Apocalypse or something. Franklin Richards, who was like the Fantastic Four's son, did something with different dimensions, and then there was kind of like an alternate universe, or in the alternate universe of the whole Marvel comic books, there was different characters, and most of the characters that you see in the actual movies are a lot more based on the alternate universe versions of these characters than they are with like the Earth 616. If I'm not mistaken. Anyway, this is nerding out a bit. I don't know as much about these things, but I know more than average. So regardless, that's what I know about comic books. How many people actually know things about these stories that they're complaining about? Things like Snow White. I went and looked about the history of this, and they say in other versions of the tale, including in Belgium and the Netherlands, Snow White is befriended by 17 robbers who live in a cave, rather than 7 dwarfs who live in a cottage. And so this is what I was thinking. Even with this story, I don't remember the dwarves in the story actually living in caves. I thought they worked in mines. And as I've mentioned, this is current timeline. This inanity came up first just recently with the Little Mermaid casting for the upcoming live action film. They went with an actress and singer named Halle Bailey. I think it's Halle Bailey. It might be Haley Bailey, but it's Halle Bailey. She has a rather big following by the younger people. And again, this is a film probably being made for children, mostly children. Most people are like early teens at most. So it's going to make sense to cast people that are speaking, that are reaching out to this, but then you have like adults. Suppose people of adult age like reading about recasting. So she is not white. She is not a natural redhead, but this was an issue for some people. Like, you're just messing with my culture. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Are you a mermaid? Like, who is this my culture you're speaking about? So I decided to look more into the actual story, and it's a Dutch story. So unless you live in the Netherlands, because I don't actually buy this whole like united global white culture. I've said this before and I still think it. I think the terms black, specifically black, are specifically speaking about mostly American descendants of slaves. So this is mostly something based in the United States of America. And even white is something mostly in the US. Because when you go to Europe, they don't really play that much. It doesn't exist. Many actual Dutch people would mock you for trying to appropriate their culture. If you're just like some guy born, let's say you're born in New England, you're born in like Massachusetts, and your whole family has been there since like the Mayflower or whatever. And then you go to like the Netherlands and you start saying you're part of their culture. You don't know any of their language. You don't know any of the locations and things. And you say that's part of, no, it's not part of your culture. You're an American. You're an American. Specifically, a Massachusettsian or Massachusettsan. What would they say to the people from that kind of place? Okay, so that's kind of what they go there. So that doesn't really exist. Should the only real retelling about The Little Mermaid, that story, be in the Dutch language, since that's what it was originally written in? And many people say, no, it can be in English. But they say, no, but the mermaid, it's a white. It was written in the Netherlands, so this would be white. But really, dudettes, and everyone else in between, it's a freaking mermaid. What race are mermaids? If they are mermaid races, then why wouldn't these mermaids have the ability to swim around the world's oceans? Or do they have those imaginary borders in the oceans too, where they're like, okay, you can't actually go here? I get when you're a human being, you can't just walk across the ocean to go to another place. But why wouldn't the mermaids be able to swim? The mixed race mermaids that look similar to what Halle Bailey looks like, Haley Bailey looks like now. Why wouldn't they be able to like swim from the coast of Africa and then go up to the Netherlands and be the person that book was based on? Why wouldn't they be able to do that? Also, it's not just like the mermaid. It's not a simple mermaid based on simple Earth with the whole like evolution type of thing. These are magical beings with like the leg transformation and those kind of things. So most of these complaints that people are having about this live action Disney recasting are based off of the Disneyfied version of that story. And that Disneyfied version was already targeted to certain groups of people that did changes from the actual initial story. And in many cases, if you actually read the original stories from those oral traditions, like with this one, with, with The Little Mermaid, you can't really just tell this story to actual people today. Like, if you actually just decided to go and tell the story as it was actually told to your average kid today, you might have like Child Protective Services called on you. It's a rather more brutal story, and I'd say it's more of a PG-13 currently. It was made for kids back then, but kids back then are somewhat different than kids today. So as I spoke of before with the Carmilla thing, I don't necessarily have to be an 18-year-old Austrian girl for me to actually feel that that story speaks to me in a certain way. It's still a great vampire story, and for those of you who haven't read it, it's, I think, one of the first known, or at least one of the first vampire stories that was written and has been carried on throughout history. You should definitely check it out. It's like a short book, it's a short story. You should definitely check it out, really cool. So they don't have to have it be in Austrian. And that's not just because someone might think, okay, it was based in Austria, so it should be Austrian people, it should be in Austrian. Some people might go that far. Very few people will go that far. But they don't actually understand this story. Even if it wasn't that the story was originally written in English and was published to the London-based Dark Blue, and it was in the English language by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. He was Irish. He was writing about Austrians. He was writing it in English. He was writing it in London. But I don't think people back then was like, this story, for it to be authentic, it must be told in Austrian. That's not something that really people with, I think, other things. These kind of things, these kind of regressive type of complaints are first world projections, first world perceptions. These are only things that can be perceived from being in the sort of privileged position that living in a first world kind of culture, currency, or civilization can give, that this is an issue for you. Now, the probable origin of the Snow White tale is as a historical European folktale that was eventually codified in Grimm's fairy tales. It's certainly of European origin, and I think they kind of found, I was looking around a bit, and there's some German one that was the authentic one, but as we've talked about here, I don't think you think it would have to be in that original language that it was first told for it to be authentic when you're retelling the story. But some of you might say, no, to be authentic, at least it has to be from the general region. You know, England is really not that far from Germany and the same continent. So they're European languages. We're going to put that. European is one of the white languages, you might say. But is that really true? So would you say something like the film like Black Panther? If you're making Black Panther, you need to reinvent a new language called Wakandan for true authenticity. I don't necessarily think you'd think that. Or is it authentic enough to say that since Wakanda is based on the African continent, in this imaginary world where there's an African continent and there's Wakanda in there, and the people of Wakanda would also have the history of being colonized, that African continent in this other universe would have the history of being colonized, and now, like many other African countries, they speak English, French, Arabic as primary languages. So it's like, okay, it makes sense that the people in Wakanda who've come from this background also have the language of English. So if you go further with that, you can say in this situation, it's a similar way that in South America and Central America, English, Spanish, and Portuguese are some of the primary languages spoken there. So it's not necessarily so strange to have a Latina, supposedly Latina actress from these areas with some background of the Colombia type of thing. Yes, Polish, but I speak Polish, but not even there. But you have that kind of situation and say, okay, so they should actually speak that. If you actually met an Argentinian who spoke Spanish, that would not necessarily seem odd or appropriated. It is what it is at this point. But there's also a small subset of them that are fluent in German for some other interesting reasons that may claim that Snow White should be based in the tongue of the fatherland. If you change it from them, because maybe their grandparents, ancestors were the ones who actually originally came up or were back in the day telling that story in that folk tale where it was just like an oral tradition type of thing, and they're like, they've taken it away by making it English. And how dare they say these actual dwarves who are in this are actually human beings? Like, no, these are magical creatures from our culture and our history. They might think that for some reason. They might be at least one human being that thinks that. But should we listen to this human being? So even if Zegler wasn't an American, grown up in the American Western tradition with these things where we've kind of all learned these different stories, some of you, probably most of you listen to this, had heard of Snow White before this actual video. If you haven't, go check it out. Pretty cool story. But you have certain these stories. Like Camilla, it doesn't have to actually feature an Austrian-born and living 18-year-old to tell that story. When we're talking about The Little Mermaid, in what Dutch reality do Caribbean singing crabs exist as advisors to the King of Mermaids? Where's the actual truth to this? In what European country did magic mirrors exist and people being woken from comas by random kisses by princes? Where is this? Where is this place where these things actually existed? And what about, how did she even fall into that coma? Like, when she was being taken care of by the dwarves, did they know about bed sores to move her around, to do these things? And it's just it's just a little aside here. I was kind of thinking about how weird it is. Like, just thinking about historically, how many people do you think were buried while comatose, and they just suffocated to death, just in their graves? Or worse, how many people were comatose for some reason and then they woke up already being buried and they were struggling and dying? And I think some of these stories of zombies back in the day, it was probably people who just fell out into comas and then they kind of came back after being buried in like shallow graves and things like this. It's kind of weird to think about the past in that kind of way. But back to the thing. What was it about this glass box? Because in the most common kind of story of Snow White, she's put in a glass box and the prince comes and Anna kisses and then he wakes her up. But what is this glass box? Check about this retelling. What if instead of dwarfs, magical creatures, it was actually aliens? So these aliens are on Earth for some various reasons. Not too important why they're on Earth. But they know the character who Snow White is based on. And she somehow comes to be poisoned. And then these aliens trying to help her decide that they're going to actually put her in this stasis chamber. Now, these aliens are very far from home. They have limited actual resources, so they can't just heal people at all times. And previously, when they had landed on Earth, there was some other Homo sapiens that had helped them, and they helped the child of the leader of this one tribe to recover from an illness. And now those nanobots, those super alien nanobots, were still in the blood of the son of this leader of this place. So they decide, okay, we're going to take this leader's son and we're going to bring him over to where Snow White is in this stasis chamber and use him as a blood donor. And they're going to have some kind of transfusion system, and then they're going to mix those nanobots together. And then after this, the people might have fallen in love together, whatnot, but it turns out this was actually prehistory. And this is the kind of thing where these are Homo sapiens, missing link type of things. And the aliens have thought, okay, we'll help this one person because, okay, we'll not interfere too much. We'll help this one human, this one son, because the human will be helped and then he'll leave and the human won't be able to actually reproduce with anyone else because of the nanobots and things like that and whatnot. But after they had helped that initial family and the initial group, the initial tribe that helped them, they had gone out to the woods and then they had met this other female that they found some kind of attraction to it. And they were kind of like teaching them, like, okay, don't go into the tree and get these apples. And when they went to the tree to get the apples, the snake bit her and then then that's how the poison came. So this could be the reason of why this happened, and then all of a sudden these two people decide to reproduce together because now they have the nanobots together, and then that kind of leads out to the whole Garden of Eden type of thing, and then that story kind of went down through history and then has been the one that actually was in the oral tradition that led up to Snow White. That's a different kind of retelling that I think you can tell on this kind of thing. Take the dwarves out. They're not dwarves. They're aliens. These people could be people based. You could have this based in an African place, and then eventually that story went up, and then it was like in Germany. Those are the people that still remembered the story. Whatever. I just don't think that someone would say that if I did these kind of changes to the story, as long as I made sure it was based in Germany and played by white people, that all of a sudden be the same story. And this is kind of what I see with some of these things. They don't necessarily do other changes to the story. They just change one character's race, change one character's gender, change one character's sexuality, and everything else stays the same. And there's not really too much explanation of rhyme or reason of why that change has been done, besides for the sake of appearing progressive, which I refer to as regressive. So just talking about the language again. Now you have a Latina, supposed Latina actress. I think she self-identifies as a Latina, so let's just call her Latina. You have a supposed Latina actress, and people are saying, "Oh, they're changing this." Halle Bailey. I keep going back to the Halle Berry type of thing. It's Halle Bailey is not white, but is playing a character that was white-skinned, redhead in the Disney version of it. And we know there's a lot of women out there do a lot of different things with the hair color and things like that. I think there's some water type things. Who knows? Maybe even in the Under the Sea, there was ways to dye your hair to different colors. Maybe she has special hair that just changes colors and she likes the red hair color. She's a magical mermaid. Maybe she can change her skin color like some octopus or type of thing when she's kind of changing around. Because you'd say, what does a Latin American look like? What does a European look like? What does an African look like? Elon Musk is African American, but what does he look like? He doesn't look like me, but he's African American. Lewis Hamilton is supposedly one of the top British Formula One racers ever. What does he look like? Doesn't necessarily look like he's Queen Elizabeth's son. Now, speaking of Queen Elizabeth's son, now that they have, I think Harry, the redhead, he's married to Meghan Markle, who is, again, supposedly a black woman. And now they have kids in America. Are those kids American? Are those kids black? Maybe now Lewis Hamilton does look like one of Queen Elizabeth's descendants. Or they also had a son. They had a son. Yes, there was a son, Archie, and Lilibet, who's so maybe, but these kind of things are appearances. So we just call it with the culture, the language. What is the actual language? If the language can be languages from other areas, what is language? Language is a way of communicating certain ideas, and I think once you use those languages, I am someone who thinks we should have one global language. It might as well be English. Let's all learn that. You can have many other languages as well, but have one language that we can communicate general ideas about reality together. So what is the language of the Latino or the Latina, or especially the Latinx, who are mostly well-off people living in the USA rather than folk in actual Latin American countries, who may speak the actual languages that exist from pre-colonial times? The actual languages of the Latino and the Latina, and I said specifically the Latinx, are languages of European origin. They'll speak Portuguese, they'll speak Spanish, they'll speak English. Most of the people who would call themselves Latinx. And even most of the people would be like Latino, Latina, because I think if you actually go to South America, the people who speak the mestizo and the other kind of languages, they would normally identify more with that. And that's a similar thing I'm talking about with black and white. What is a black language? What is the language of black people? You would probably say English. But if you come to Kenya, if you ask the people, the Luya people have the Luya language. The Kikuyu have the Kikuyu language. You go to Italy, and even in Italy, you talk to people from Sicilia, and they have a more Sicilian tongue of their actual Italian. You go to talk to the people in Piemonte region up in Turin, they have more of a northern tongue of the Italian language. You ask them, what is the language of your people? They will say that Italian in those kind of dialects and things like that. They don't say English. But regardless, my contention is if these languages are spread around the world, these are human languages telling human stories. And those stories go across with the languages. There's some specific stories that might be told in certain things that have certain words that don't necessarily have the equivalents in other languages. I get that. That's part of why I prefer watching things with subtitles, because there's certain inflections and certain tones and certain phrases, certain emotion that's given in the actual spoken word that I think is lost when you just do a dub. Sometimes you can carry on the same things, but some things are lost in that translation. But when you already accept that it's in a familiar language, how important is it the people depicting this kind of story, this kind of idea? Because you'll have people saying that, oh, like, if you have a white person tell a story, like, one of the ones that they also say is if you just had, like, a white shaft, would that make any sense? Would people like, yeah, you're appropriating black culture? Like, it should not be a white person. This is something that's only for black people. Now, you go further and you get some stories, some historical stories from South America. If you had those and then you had, let's say, Chris Pratt playing the Montezuma, would people say this is taking away the story of it? And I think there's something similar like that where I forget who played the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston is definitely not Arabic. Is he? He's not, probably not even Jewish. He's probably not even a Semite. But they had, I don't think it was like Joffrey Rush. Let me double check. Definitely not Joffrey Rush. It was this kind of thing like an old-timey actor's name. It was Yul Brynner. And Yul Borisovich Brynner, known as Yul Brynner, was a Russian, French, Swiss, and American actor, singer, and director. He was born in 1920 in Vladivostok, Primorskaya Oblast, in the Far Eastern Republic, now Primorsky Krai, Russia. So that's who he was, who played this part. He also played King Mongkut in the Rodgers and Hammerstein stage musical The King and I. And I think that was in Asia. It was like not Mongolia, Myanmar. It was something. It was The King and I was definitely something based in Asia. So he played that. He also played the Pharaoh in Ten Commandments. He did pretty well at these roles. I haven't seen The King and I. I don't think I've seen The King and I. Definitely watch the Ten Commandments. Great movie. So you have this kind of thing where you have these different characters playing these stories. But right now, I think they're doing a Cleopatra movie, and there was some hubbub, like, you can't get Gal Gadot to play Cleopatra. Like, again, people, yes, I know back in the olden days when you had the people traveling to different places and things like that, some people from Europe went and they were kind of, some of the kings and queens were European, but most of the people were of more like, this is Arabic, you would say Arabic, North, there's different kinds of genetics and things like that going there, but does it have to be exactly that person? We're already talking about something like the Ten Commandments, we're talking about people turning sticks into snakes, like, that part you're okay with that being magical, but all of a sudden, like, you have to have this exact depiction for the actual people. These are weird things. Like, most definitely back then they were not speaking English. So why should that story from back then even be? Cleopatra didn't speak English. So why? Some of this stuff is just very frustrating to me. It can get frustrating, but I'm also kind of trying to understand why certain people bother with certain things. And I think I get it. For some people, their imagination is lacking. For some people, there's not too many other things in their life that they actually have an effect to actually deal with. This is some kind of thing where they're projecting certain things. And then, yes, for some people, from that perception that they're coming from, they have a different point of view on these things that I don't necessarily get. And I haven't really heard people go into in-depth explanations of why they feel that way. It's normally some very surface level type of thing. And yes, you have certain people, certain cultures that have secret information that they want to keep within themselves. But then, in many cases, when I've met people who have certain stories that they think are important, that they think give positive things to the world, that they think are informative, they're normally happy when they see somebody else trying to tell that story. They might say, like, no, when we said it, we meant it in this kind of way, so they give some guidance. But I don't really hear people being, like, mad, like, oh, I can't believe you're telling this story that we used to tell to our kids, to your kids now. They're like, oh, that's cool. You're actually spreading our culture out there. You're spreading our information out there. And I think that's what most people normally think when they talk about things. So I'm kind of wondering, what are the people who actually focus on these negative things? And as per usual, if you want to go back to Grimm's tales, they're still there. Some of the things you might lose, and some people say, okay, we're losing these older cultures, we need to preserve these older cultures, these older stories, these older languages. Yes, preserve them, but I think we still need one that we can all share and agree on and speak of same kind of stories. This is one of the things when I was coming away from my religious background. I started thinking that different people are speaking about the different beings, different observations that we have of reality and the unknown, and using different words and different kind of ideas. But you see certain archetypes, certain stories, certain structures are still there because it's the same human beings experiencing a similar reality on this one spaceship Earth that we have. So it makes sense that we're going to have some of the crossover in these things. Now, getting to the end of this whole thing, thanks for coming along with me on this little rant, this not a little rant, this medium-sized rant. What is your take on this? Where do you stand on this topic of representation? Do you think in this situation, whether or not they were going to depict them as dwarves in a cave, do you think it's a negative thing that was being done? Do you think this is somehow harmful to people's perception? Like, if somebody watches Snow White in that time, whatever it is set in, I don't know if it's set in modern time, but they watch it, do they seriously think that, oh, the next time I see somebody with dwarfism, a little person, that I think they live in a cave? Do people actually, how many people actually think that way? I don't think it's that many. But when it comes to this whole storytelling, I also think if you feel you're not being represented, why don't you go out there and tell a story yourself? Get that representation out there. Put it in a way that you find speaks to you. But then that's another thing. We have different levels of creativity, different levels of time. Some people just can't tell that. Though I think some people just don't know that they can tell stories. Because you tell stories in your mind. Some people will come up with this and, oh, we need representation, and in their mind they'll have some story of why they need representation. That's not necessarily based on reality. That's already some form of storytelling. But for the grander storytelling in general, I'm working on a cloud storytelling platform for those interested in telling, hearing, reading, creating, participating in stories, and many other things. Because I think that is a key part of the human condition, telling stories about things. That's part of why we have languages, to tell stories and depictions that try to encapsulate the reality or ideas or thoughts or things that we have that we've seen, experienced, and thought of. And I think once you put a story out there, it's no longer yours. It's part of the information that any sentient being that comes into contact with can absorb and partake in. Some changes can add new facets to the story that just enrich it, and some can present unhelpful challenges that almost negate the actual purpose of the primary story that was being told. But then when it gets enriched, when it gets negated on either end of the spectrum, it can morph that thing into an entirely different story. For example, you could take the entire idea of Wakanda and have it based in the Amazon with descendants from the tribes that go back to pre-colonial times. And then what would be the point of just saying, like, you have that already, you have that as a setting. What would the point of just saying, like, okay, the Black Jaguar character, who's not, instead of the Black Panther, it's a Black Jaguar. They also have, like, I think they also call them Black Panthers when they're in, like, the Amazon and things like this. But when you think the Black Panther, instead of the Black Panther, in fact, I think I was more familiar with Black Panthers coming from the Amazon than I didn't really think they really had that many Black Panthers in Africa. And regardless, okay, so the Black Jaguar, what would be the purpose of saying that the Black Jaguar character, we're just going to switch him around to being a 6'6", red-headed, freckled Asian woman just for representation? Just that one character. No other person is of a different ethnicity than the tribes of people descended from tribes living in the Amazon. So yeah, just that. Just that one tall, red-headed Asian woman, we're just going to plop her in there to represent, just from a representation. I don't think that necessarily makes sense unless you have something else going around with why that character is that character. That's part of what helps have that suspension of disbelief. That challenge is going to be harder when you just make certain decisions that are not necessarily serving the actual story and serving some kind of agenda or point that is outside of the actual story, such as, quote, progressivism, end quote. So from my perception, my understanding, the way I deal with stories is they are not actually written in stone. Even if these were literally stories that were originally written in stone, they are not written in stone, because before they were actually written in stone, they were just told. They were told by people to other people. Since they've been written in stone, they've been transferred to other languages. They've been transferred to other mediums. They've been transferred to other ways. There's many stories that you might think are original and a change is made to them, and you say, why don't we just stick to the original? And you don't even know that that original actually came from something a lot earlier, especially when you talk about something like the religions, which are some of the stories that most of us tell, that most of us feel need to be some sort of dogma. You will be very surprised how many of the stories in the various religions that you might believe in actually go all the way back to like the Sumerian ones, which the Sumerian ones were the first gods who actually were written about, who were passed on in history. But they were not the first gods. We know that people had beliefs in gods and certain archetypes and certain stories even before then. So that's kind of a thing that we have. Now, another thing that I think has happened now is more recently, these stories have gotten to the point where if these stories had been told 200, 300, 400 years ago, they would actually be religions. But now we just consider them to be stories, and then those stories have their fandoms, and those fandoms are as almost devout as the average religious person was back in the day. Maybe not back in the day, maybe they were more devout back then, but the average religious person today is probably even less devout than, let's say, your really strong Star Wars like fandom type of person. Like, I know all these things about Star Wars, but the average person, how much do they actually know about the Bible? The average Christian in the United States of America, probably not that much. Probably you go to an average person at like a Star Trek convention, and they know more about the lore in the Star Trek universe. Like, it wouldn't just be surface level. Like, oh yeah, there was like a New Hope, and there was like Return of the Jedi, and there was like the Empire Strikes Back. They would know more about that original trilogy, about the lore in the whole greater Star Wars universe, than they would if they identified as one of the Abrahamic trilogy of religions that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I think they would already have selected that. So there is that aspect in there, and I get that consideration. And now, speaking about this topic with dwarves and language and lore and stories that I think could be religion, that could be these grander things, we'll finish this off with talking about Lord of the Rings. This is one of my favorite series of books. Like, it's a great book. I mean, definitely go check it out. Even if you've watched the movie, that is one of the best, I think, retellings of a movie, of movieization of a book that I've ever seen. I didn't really like the Hobbit series. I watched it. I didn't really like them as much, but just the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. Great things. But still, there was an amazing extra parts of it in the book. And I'm thinking now that they're coming with a series, I'm not really that interested in watching the series, but there might be some things like Tom Bombadil. He might actually be brought in. But with my imagination, there was some visuals I was seeing about some characters that I don't think were done justice. Like the ideas that I had in my mind was something like Shelob. I had this whole different kind of creature in mind than was depicted in the movie. But I understand those limitations. And I understand that. I don't really feel like, oh, this is taking it away from the way it's supposed to be. Like, no, because these different stories kind of exist separately to me. This is Peter Jackson's telling of it was grand in its own way. Tolkien had other ideas in his mind. And when I was reading the book, really liked those series. And I went back and read the Silmarillion, and then that got me some other ideas into it. It's like, oh, this is where you're coming from, the thing. Then I figured out that, oh, he was actually doing this because he was based on Elvish. He went to this language, he went to the world where these things kind of existed in. And I think the series now is coming out that's more based off of the prehistory stuff. Get some stuff from the Silmarillion. I might be saying that name wrong in that book, but that's more of like a thesaurus of like an encyclopedia of the world of of Middle Earth and the elves and the dwarves and the different kind of like beings from beneath the earth, the Balrogs, those type of things. So now there's some reaction to having the different humanish races in this new series. Does it matter to me? No, not so much. Is it possible that if there was a world like that with a different biology that would result in elves, dwarves, hobbits, and more with skin tones and features as varied as humans, yes, it's possible. If there was a situation where there was a location, a physical place where evolution worked towards the biology of these elves, dwarves, and hobbits and things like that, where they would have a more white skinish Euro features type of things in that planet and that reality, and where those phenotypes would be selected for, then it does make some sense that there also would be some more African-based continents, some more Asia-based continents, some more like South American kind of location-wise based continents. If this is a world the kind of same size as the Earth and things like that, it does make sense that they would have some people like that. Then you add the fact that these people have magical ways of traveling long distances. So it's okay. So maybe they would have been able to actually move to a certain location and actually meet that. But if your story is based in a landlocked area, before the life forms in that area had the ability to travel long distances, then chances are it would select for a certain type of people, a certain appearance of people, a certain size of people. It would be limited due to the location that they're in there. Just throwing people in without explanation is different. Just for, hey, we're just going to have this. It's a nuisance. It's something that I would personally avoid if I was telling a story. So now, this is to me. I do not think that someone must look like X, think like X, or be from Z to play a character who is supposed to appear like X, thinks Y, and is from Z. That's just a basic thing, and most of you out there who might have issues with it can probably think back to situations where there was a character in the story that you really enjoyed that had been changed from the story that that story was based on, and you enjoyed it for those changes. Because yes, Tolkien was inspired by the people and the locations and the things that were going on in the world around him. I get that. But no one would say, I don't, and very few of you would say, like, okay, no, because the Scandinavians were probably based on, were probably the people like the elves and kind of things are based on. So we have to have someone of Scandinavian kind of ancestry and things like the genetics. We can't have like the Scotsmen playing them. We can't have like some red-headed big elf. That's not it. But for some reason, it seems to fit to have like the dwarves with these ruddy, kind of red-headed type of tough people and things like that. There's something that's in there. Who were the hobbits? Was it the Welsh? Were the Welsh the hobbits? Could you have an Italian person play a hobbit? Like, where's your actual issue with this? Like, what sort of ancestry are you calling on to say that it is your culture that the story must remain as is? If a book is, if some story is containing some atrocities, then it is also part of who you personally are today. These are atrocities from way back in the day or some imaginary place. Is that part of who you are now? If not, then don't claim umbrage at slights and attacks that are levied upon characters who may share traits that you have, but are not who you actually are. In a situation that kind of speaks to this as well is with J.K. Rowling saying that only British kids could be cast as the characters in Harry Potter. Because Hogwarts was a school that drew its students from that in-universe version of Britain. So it's supposed to be in our actual universe. In the story, yes, it's supposed to be actual Earth, but then there's this kind of place where you go through that railway station and you go to the place and so I understand it. That's a dedication and extra authenticity to get that actual aspect into the actual story. They committed to the bit and they carried it on to other roles and to the extent where there's other speaking roles. You know when they had that one, I forget, was it the Chamber of Secrets? No, it was the one where they had the tournament and they had schools coming from other locations. And I think they also had that situation where they said, okay, if this is somebody from the Eastern European area, I think the Victor Krum or whatnot was actually a Bulgarian actor, like actually Bulgarian born and living and things like that. So they had that extra aspect. I guess that's something that they're going for on it. But would you have to say that now if you're putting on a Harry Potter stage play anywhere in the world, because they did this for the movie, and J.K. Rowling, the actual writer, creator of the story, is someone who has expressed the like to do this. So in order to do this, we have to find British kids to play in all the stage plays of Harry Potter all over the world. Like we can't have this in China if it's just Chinese people. It has to be British people. We can't have this in Nairobi. We have to ship in some British people to do this. I don't think J.K. Rowling would appreciate that. And again, remember, Harry Potter is something based off of our world. Harry Potter and those characters are people from our world, Homo sapiens, going into a location where there's magic. But in this magical world, it has its own different rules. People change appearances, entirely different appearances. People have heads in the back of the heads. Some people are like animals. There's talking animals. There's all kinds of different kind of things in there. So why are you basing that on the biology, on the evolution, on the different cultural differences that we have in our world? Why bring that in there when it's not necessarily needs to be in there? I don't understand the reasoning behind some of this. So I'm not going to get the chance to sit down with Peter Dinklage and hear his thoughts about this, but let me know. As I mentioned in other things like Lord of the Rings, they had just human beings, average height human beings, playing characters that were short. Characters that are not human. When I think dwarves, as I mentioned, I think these different kind of beings. Like this is the Gimli type of thing. Like I'm thinking about the scene of Moria. And this is another thing with dwarves. I think of dwarves and I think of the dwellings of dwarves, and maybe it's because Lord of the Rings speaks to me so much, but I don't necessarily think of dwarves as cave dwellers. Not in that sense of just brutish caves kind of. I think more like orcs, cave trolls. You mean the cave trolls type of thing, like in Lord of the Rings, they have a cave troll. Because there's specific trolls that live in certain locations even with that. But with the dwarves, I think of Moria. Or Khazad-dûm. That was such a cool name, Khazad-dûm. Moria, that kind of place, the grandeur of that place. And that to me is such a cooler fantasy location than many other homes and things like that. Like the Hobbit holes definitely have nothing on Moria, have nothing on Khazad-dûm. And you have a scene like that where these dwarves are entirely different species. Those are not humans. The humans in that world are the Northmen, the people from Aragorn and things like that. They were the ones that are based in the Humes and things like that. And that's why I'm thinking this might be a story where ostensibly I might think it's a prehistory type of thing, where somehow human beings on Earth kind of came from those people. But whatever, the elves, again, those are separate beings. They're not actual humans. The orcs are not like, oh, that's the black people of it. No, they're not. Those are separate people. Then they had some people who came in who were working with Saruman and things like that, who were like from a different zone. And I think they had different like facial features and looks and things like that. So you have some kind of estimation that within the world of Tolkien, there are other, there's not just the Middle Earth area. I think Middle Earth was a planet, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I was a bit mistaken, and now that's because I'm adding my current timeline perception of the world to what was back then. You got to think with these back things, Middle Earth is a fictional setting of much of the English writers J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy. The term is equivalent to Mjolnir of North mythology, or Midangiard in Old English works, including Beowulf. And Middle Earth is a human inhabited world that is the central continent of the Earth. So that's what they were calling that area, Middle Earth. So central continent. So that already establishes there were other continents out there, and the people from those other continents might have looked different, might have evolved in different ways, might have had different appearances. We even have the stories of the elves kind of sailing away to different locations where the elves were from. So this is the kind of thing. There's also dragons, trolls, all these ants. Like, who are the ants? Who are the human ants? Should really tall people be offended of the way the ants are? Oh, the ants takes no. These are fantasy things. I don't understand why people can't separate these things away from each other. So when you have this aspect, there's this part in when they're escaping from Khazad-dûm, when the Balrog comes out and they're going down, and then they're crossing over that place, and then the stairs kind of drop, and then some of the hobbits are thrown across, and then it gets to the point where Aragorn and Gimli are stuck on that side, and the thing is falling, and then Aragorn is going to like throw him. It's like nobody tosses a dwarf, and you have this kind of thing where there was a certain pride within the dwarven people. And was it all the dwarven people, or was it just like the rulers of the dwarven people, because those are the people that were interacted with the most? But there is something about that. I don't really go around and see a Peter Dinklage person with his condition and think he will have that gruff, tough hysteria of a dwarf. But then I have a friend who was telling me about this. Derek was telling me about he's met some people with dwarfism, with different conditions, and they seem to have some kind of orneriness towards the world. And I'm thinking, I can empathize that if I was even just left-handed, that would be an issue, because things are made to be like for most right-handed people. There's some challenges with that. But when you go now further with the height, I can't imagine being under 5. I mean, I can imagine. I can only imagine. But the struggles, it's hard to empathize, hard to realize the different struggles that you would have for being really short. It's kind of a tough thing to deal with when most of the things are kind of organized for that. I was kind of thinking like it'd be kind of cool to have some kind of area, an amusement park, not an amusement park, but an area or something where you have like a barn or a location where you can go, and everything in that room is like the size of when you're a kid, when you're a toddler, you're like a foot and a half tall. So you have everything else in proportion where everything is that size. Where you get that point of view again and realize how you were looking at the world as a kid, but with your more adult mentality. But the different thing with children is they normally grow. So you're growing into the world. But when you have one of these dwarfism conditions, you're stuck at that point. And I think there is an aspect out there that has an extra challenge. And I can see some issues with some of these depictions coming out, where people look at it, and I think people infantilize when you're at that size, literally infantilize, and especially these progressive type of people, I think they baby these people. They make children out of these people. And you see this with their select pet projects. They're like our boy Zach over at Comics Matter calls them purse puppies. People get these different races and things like that, and these minorities, and say, oh, we're going to treat them this kind of way and treat them like those purse puppies where they have those little toy dogs and they dress them up and treat them and say, oh, this little cute little dog. Yeah. There's that aspect, and I think there is that aspect that. So yes, for Peter Dinklage, he might feel that from his soapbox, him speaking out like this has done enough. He might feel like these are my people. But as we mentioned, his main family, his immediate family, he was the only one with that condition. So who are his people? Is it white people? I don't know. Maybe he's like, like you changed Snow White was part of my culture, and like no, it's not white people in this sense. Is it somehow all the people in the world with achondroplasia? Is it specifically that kind of condition? Or is he talking about people with other conditions as well? Like Vern Troyer, the late Vern Troyer, who played Mini-Me in the Austin Powers series? Or would Vern Troyer feel like, no, I have a different condition that you do, so you don't really speak for me as my people? I don't really understand how far these things go. And now, whenever you decide to take on these other aspects of storytelling, it's non-story driven decisions. This is what you will expect. Whenever people start saying, oh, we need representation, that has nothing to do with the story, but it's just for these other social signaling type of things. And I don't think you should pass this test of time. It will never be enough. Some of the best stories emulate reality. They might change some things around, they might alter some things, but the best stories, in my estimation, exist in a functional reality that the story is based in, if that makes any sense. And from all the realities that I've thought of, these realities don't really care about how represented you feel. Reality itself. And one thing that I did mention a bit before was the whole thing with the religions. Part of why I'm saying this is similar to the fandom. The fandoms is similar to the religions that they had, where these stories were written earlier in different times would be considered religions. Because think about when it comes to religions. Religions, they have this idea that the being or the forces that created reality actually do care about how represented you are. They care about your feelings. So in this situation, you feel, okay, this is a story that I feel this emotional, almost religious connection to, and I'm not represented into it. So if I'm part of this, then I can say, okay, that's my part in that world. That could be something that might drive it for some people. So thank you all very much for listening to this, and we're at the end of this. And you can like, share, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this. There's other content like this. I think going forward, I'm going to be going to more things with conversations. I'm going to be working on that cloud storytelling platform that I was talking about. So I'll be focusing a lot more on talking about stories, telling stories, stories that people tell, either your personal lives or creative stories, and telling you more about the stories that I have to tell about different things. And another way you can help support this content is I have a Redbubble store for now. You can check that out. There's different content and merchandise you can buy from there. I think there will be some speed drawing going on the screen. I might possibly have done this thing where I'm practicing to draw with my left hand, and there's going to be a drawing what we're doing with my left of some different dwarves, and I've seen some different armors, and it was a helmet that I saw somebody do online, this Mitographia type of site, and then I was like, okay, this could be a dragon, and I was like, okay, instead of a dragon, it could be a dwarf, so there's probably some armor I've done like left hand testing with it, then I might have done some other stuff with it. But on this merchandise store, there's this thing with the Thomas Sowell 3, and Thomas Sowell is an economist, and he has these 3 questions he normally asks people on the left about economics that normally take down all the arguments on that. And these 3 questions are things that I think apply to the rest of life, because in general, I think economics and these kind of considerations, these political philosophy type of things, are things that apply in different places. And those 3 questions are compared to what, at what cost, and what solid proof do you have. You can get different kinds of merchandise with these questions on it. And I'm going to apply it to this situation with Peter Dinklage. So compared to what? He's saying in this situation, the depiction of dwarves in this story is negative and it hurts him and it's not progressive, but I say compared to what? As I discussed here, is that really progressive to cast Zegler as Snow White? I don't think it's that big of an issue. If anything, I think it's regressive, cheering it like it is something worth cheering. And then you compare the story to what? What are the depictions of dwarves in this? That's assuming, again, that these are Homo sapiens, and with conditions, and not just a separate species. But do they live in caves compared to what other depictions of dwarves that are so negative? We don't necessarily know. Maybe he knows from being an insider, he had somebody tell him exactly how they were going to be depicted in the story. But if it was like hobbits, where they lived in like a hobbiton type of thing, hobbit holes or something, and they were farmers, farmer-gatherers, and they had no actual cave type of thing, not even working in the mines, like I remember. They worked in mines, again, not lived in the actual caves. So you had this situation. Would he have been okay with that? And he's like, oh, that seems normal and okay, I have no problem with this depiction, and would he have not said anything? Because living in caves sounded rather specific to just be kind of thrown, but some people just say things to say things. Now, at what cost? Again, we don't know who was going to be cast for these positions, but ostensibly this could have been 7 actors with conditions that were going to be cast as the dwarves in this actual movie, that now that Disney is deciding to take these characters out, this could have been 7 people who have lost some work. This could have been a different depiction of dwarves, as I mentioned, as hunter-gatherers in different kind of situations, different kind of environments. And they might have been some people that were open to seeing them in a different light due to this, and then now they've been taken out. If they just now say, okay, we're going to have just regular average height humans, as we're just going to go with the thieves type of situation, then is that something that's taken away representation of people with conditions, of height challenged people? I don't know. Maybe it is. Now, what solid proof do you have? This one is the key type of thing. What solid proof does he have that these kind of depictions somehow have a direct negative effect on how people that he considers his people are treated? As I mentioned, could be in his lived experience. Maybe he's seen some kind of direct connection that somebody just came out of watching a film with dwarves in it and then saw him. It's like, hey, you're like that little person from this little thing, and then yeah, to make fun of you. Maybe that's something that's happened to his life, and he's carried that on with him, and he's seen it happen in other people. I think he has kids, and I don't think they have the condition that he has. But he could be looking out for other people in that kind of way. Now, for other people who just have complaints about recasting, and I think in this situation, Peter Dinklage is making a complaint to ask for a sort of recasting, sort of change on an actual story based on reasons that we have, where some people are like, we need more representation and change these characters for reasons that we have. What solid proof do you have that that representation actually achieves anything positive that you are saying? What solid proof do you have that other people need this to that point? And on the other side of this, what solid proof do you have that claiming the change should not occur, that the story should stay as is actually based on a story that had not already been changed from what it was before? What solid proof do you have that those changes are actually going to alter that story to a point where it's no longer the core part of the story that might appeal to you is no longer told due to them changing a character, changing the location, changing something the person says, changing a relationship dynamic? I don't necessarily think that in many cases people have the solid proof to back the things that they actually say. But that's it for me. This has been Silas. This has been a rant about what Peter Dinklage said with perception on different kinds of things. I think it's going to be titled Peter Dinklage versus Progressive Dwarf Dodgers, and with that kind of situation, because these people, the progressives, if you keep making these decisions just for virtue signaling, it's never going to be enough. Someone will take issue with you. This is a race to the bottom, and that bottom is, we still haven't reached the bottom. This is still further to go. We can still get some master dwarves to keep plumbing those depths, and when you plumb those depths, like in Khazad-dûm, down below there, all you're going to find is just creatures like the Balrogs who just destroy everything. Even worse creatures like the Balrogs. So the Balrogs are not the only ones. And like with this, I actually went and I read the actual history. And there's a lot of kind of like eldritch beings in the deep depths of the earth and things like that. And when you start going to those points, that's all you're going to find there. Just some grime, just some mess, just some destruction, just some nonsense. So let's kind of avoid that kind of stuff. Although that kind of stuff has its own appeal for its own purpose. But that's neither here nor there. That's not here. It's over there. Okay, it's over there, down dark there, but that's not the stories that we're talking about right now. So till next time, thank you all very much. A lot more other content coming, a lot more content wherever you're hearing this is already up. Goodbye.